The Revenant. In 1823, 40-year-old Hugh Glass was in the middle of a fur trading venture in the South Dakota wilderness when he was severely wounded by a grizzly bear protecting her cubs. His fellow explorers left him for dead, but Glass survived and swore to seek revenge. As explorer Hugh Glass regained consciousness after being mauled by a bear, he found himself dispossessed of any weapons or tools to aid him. In addition, his ribs were exposed on his back, and he had a broken leg. Glass set the bone of his own leg, let the maggots eat his rotten flesh to avoid gangrene, and wrapped himself in the bear hide his companions had tossed on top of him. He then began a 200-mile trek through the South Dakota wilderness to the nearest American settlement, Fort Kiowa. Glass crawled through the freezing terrain until he reached the Cheyenne River, where he assembled a raft that carried him downstream. He survived mostly on wild berries, roots, and bison meat. The journey took him 6 weeks. Legend says that Glass had lived among pirates at some point, and that he was even part of the Native American Pawnee tribe. His adventures and experiences came valuable during the distressing voyage back to civilization. It is also said that during the journey, a group of Native Americans sewed the bear hide into his skin to protect his wounds. And by using the Thunder Butte landform as a navigational reference, Glass finally reached Fort Kiowa. After recovering from his lesions, Glass resolved to take vengeance against the 2 men that abandoned him to his fate. He spent 9 months hunting them down before confronting them and deciding they weren't worth killing. He let go of the first one, known as Bridges, on account of his youth. He then found out that the second one, John Fitzgerald, had joined the army. Unwilling to put down a soldier because he would be punished, Glass warned him to never quit the army, or he would still go after him. Keepsake. In August 1867, Native Americans scalped Englishman William Thompson while heading to work on a railroad in Nebraska. Union Pacific wasn't receiving any telegraph feed west of Plum Creek Station, so they dispatched 5 brave repair workers to fix the problem. After a steep curve, they stumbled upon several railroad ties, and their handcar was derailed. An ambush was waiting for them. 25 Cheyenne warriors attacked the repair party on their way to Plum Creek Station. William Thompson was first shot in the upper arm. He was then picked up by one of the braves and brutally scalped. It's believed that Thompson was conscious during the act, and there's still debate as to how he could pull through the incision in total silence. After the attack, a train with 17 cars coming from Omaha was derailed too, becoming the first successful train derailment by Native Americans in U.S. history. Union Pacific became aware of the occurrences and sent a second rescue train the next day. Thompson was the only man alive and had a terrible wound that was already infected. He was then taken to Dr. R.C. Moore, who unsuccessfully tried to reattach his scalp. Still, the tough Englishman survived the infection. Fascinated by the specimen, Thompson kept the scalp and put it on display for money. He later donated it to Dr. Moore, who handed the piece to the Omaha Public Library. Lynn Sullivan, the library specialist at the place, once recounted to local news how, quote, "There was one particular young gentleman who wanted to see it. He said he wanted to see something actual instead of something virtual to make sure it really existed." And it does exist. It can currently be found at the W. Dale Clark Library in Omaha, Nebraska. Head like a hole. During the Battle of Chickamauga, fought in September of 1863, Union soldier Jacob Miller was shot in the forehead and left behind for dead. Hours later, as the Union forces were retreating from Brock Field, Miller regained consciousness while at the Confederate line's rear, but he was not willing to become a prisoner. The Battle of Chickamauga would become the most significant Union defeat in the Western Theater and the second most lethal battle of the Civil War, just behind the Battle of Gettysburg. As Jacob Miller regained consciousness after being shot in the head, he got up using his gun as a staff. He then retreated some distance before moving parallel to enemy lines towards his own side. Completely soaked in blood, the enemy didn't recognize he was a Yank. Not even his former captain recognized him when he caught up with his unit. Doctors refused to operate on him, believing he was likely to die during the night and not wanting to cause further pain, but Miller survived. The soldier struggled for 9 months until he got a furlough home. Back in Logansport, he underwent surgery from Doctors Filch and Coleman, who were able to remove the bullet. Days after the operation, Miller returned to the hospital at Madison, where he stayed until his enlistment expired almost an exact year after the battle, on September 17, 1864. The musket hole would never entirely heal, and Miller lived for more than 50 years with excruciating headaches that never went away. However, he was consistently optimistic and found no one to blame, even claiming that the government was gracious enough to pay him $40 every month as a pension. Miller then added, quote, 17 years after I was wounded, a buckshot dropped out of my wound, and 31 years after, 2 pieces of lead came out. A distinctive frown indeed. Alive. In 1972, a Uruguayan Air Force turboprop carrying a rugby team crashed after clipping an Andes peak at 13,800 feet. The survivors made camp in the bitter cold until they learned from a small radio that search efforts had been canceled after 11 days. As the group's supplies were exhausted, they had no choice but to cannibalize the perished in order to survive. On October 13, 1972, 45 passengers took off from Mendoza, Argentina, on their way to Santiago de Chile for an upcoming rugby match. At 3:21 p.m., the pilot last reported their location to Santiago's control tower among thick clouds and strong winds. In the next 5 minutes, the plane impacted the Andean pikes and lost its wings and tail. Only the fuselage continued to slide down the side of a mountain until it finally stopped. 32 survivors in summer clothing came outside to find endless snow around them. By 3:27 p.m., rescue patrols were already searching for the missing plane, but the heavy snow hindered the operation. To survive, the team rationed the few pieces of chocolate and snacks they had. They also continually listened to a small radio for more than a week, and were devastated to hear that the rescue attempt had been canceled 11 days after the crash. During the following days, the team acknowledged that they needed to eat from the deceased bodies as a means of survival. Not everyone was convinced at first, but they agreed that they would be proud to help the others by offering their flesh if someone died among them. The tissue was dried on the plane's metallic surface exposed directly by the sun, while snow was melted in bottles for water. They also lit small fires with some wood and bills they found on the plane. As the southern summer solstice approached, the group decided that someone should leave to look for help. Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa volunteered. They hiked for 10 days, crossed the Chilean frontier, and were finally rescued by a local shepherd. The remaining 14 survivors were found the following day. The group claims to this day that fear had pushed them, but they survived on friendship. Stubborn old man. During the American Revolution, British forces were making their way back from the battles of Lexington and Concord to Boston while facing fierce opposition from American soldiers. One of them was 78-year-old Samuel Whittemore, who became the oldest known colonial combatant to participate in the war. Born in 1696 in Charleston, Massachusetts, Samuel Whittemore had fought in King George's War from 1744 to 1748 and was involved in capturing the French stronghold fortress of Louisbourg. He's believed to have fought in the French and Indian Wars, too. The opening engagements of the American Revolution had taken place in Lexington and Concord, and the British forces were marching back to Boston. On April 19, 1775, Whittemore was working on his fields when he spotted an approaching relief brigade led by Lieutenant General Hugh Percy coming to the British forces' aid. Old Whittemore ambushed the British grenadiers from behind a stone wall. He shot one soldier with his musket, then killed a second, and fatally wounded a third with his pistol. By then, Whittemore had given away his position and was approached by a British detachment. He then drew his sword, but was immediately shot in the face and bayoneted several times. Drowned in a pool of blood, Whittemore was left behind. However, he was later found alive by colonial forces, attempting to load his musket, ready to resume the fight. Whittemore was taken to Dr. Cotton Tufts of Medford, who didn't expect him to survive. But the former soldier wasn't ready to give up and recovered to live another 18 years until he was 96. A monument in his name now stands in Arlington, Massachusetts. It inaccurately reads, quote, "Near this spot, Samuel Whittemore, then 80 years old, killed 3 British soldiers April 19, 1775. He was shot, bayoneted, beaten, and left for dead, but recovered and lived to be 98 years of age."